What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of My Counseling Corner. My name is Luke. I am your counselor, and it's been a while since we did a video. It's been probably about a year now. So I wanted to make this video, though, because this is something that I think is very important, and I've had a unique opportunity recently to talk about it and to answer some questions about it. So what we're talking about is divorce, and specifically we're talking about the way that kids, students, middle school, high school, elementary age students respond to a divorce. The reason that I'm even making this video, so that I can give credit where credit is due, a student from West Virginia University, a counseling student in the graduate program at West Virginia, reached out to our practice and wanted to get our opinions on some questions, or get our answers to some questions that he is hoping to use, I guess, for a paper or some kind of essay or assignment for a class. So I want to give credit to him if he's watching this. Obviously, I'm not going to use his name on the internet without his permission. But that's the reason we were able to make this video. So credit goes to him. He asked some very good questions. And even though some of these things may sound obvious, or they may sound like things that everyone just kind of knows, it's probably not very often that we get a chance to articulate some of these ideas or really talk about them. So that's what I wanted to do today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read his questions, and I might just go through and read my response to those questions. And then after I read the response, we may talk about it in a little more detail. It's probably going to be kind of a longer video, longer than some of the previous ones. I'll try to stick to the points and not get too off track and ramble like I tend to do. So hopefully we can get through it on a timely manner. So his first question that he writes is, why are other areas of life affected by divorce, such as school, work, and behavior? So my answer to that question was this. Many of the issues associated with divorce come from this idea of attachment, and anyone who is a mental health practitioner or anyone who's just in the medical profession probably has heard at least of attachment theory and what it is. It is this idea that because we are social creatures and we've adapted over the years to connect with people and build attachments and build relationships with people, when those relationships are threatened, it kicks in the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight, flight, or freeze response. So the reason that people build attachments is really for a survival skill. It's a survival mechanism. And this goes back to when we were, hunter-gatherers living in caves, and if you encountered a predator like a bear in the jungle or something like that, you had more of a chance of fighting it off if there was a bigger group of you, like 10 people, as opposed to if there were just 2 or 3 of you. You had a better chance of surviving if you traveled in a big group. So that's in a very rough outline, kind of the theory of attachment. I know I'm not doing it credit, but that's kind of the basis of it. So my answer is that since every child's primary attachment is with their parents, typically that's the first attachment we make is with our biological parents, if the brain perceives that that attachment is being threatened, which often happens in divorce situations, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in and gets activated, which puts the child in this state of chronic hypervigilance. So the sympathetic nervous system is kind of what I just described, that fight, flight, or freeze response. But normally that response is there to address something that's very immediate, a very abrupt or short-term situation. Okay, so if we're going to use our bear example, something that happens, you encounter the bear in the jungle or the wild, and you deal with it. You either fight it off, run away, or you freeze up and don't do anything. But then the experience ends. So your body has time to come down and your brain can kind of decompress a little bit. But if the brain views our attachments as being threatened or they're in jeopardy, it creates this chronic state of hypervigilance that's spread out over a long period of time, which creates a lot of stress. And that is a very, very difficult state to maintain. It's very stressful, it wears on you very much to maintain that level of hypervigilance. So this chronic state becomes a lot of the reason why so many facets of life are affected. So your school might be affected, your home life will be affected, your social life will be affected. That's kind of how how that works. So that's the way I answer that question. Second question is, what is the most common type of harmful behavior that kids revert to because of a divorce, such as a short temper or a more physical mentality, and why do they act out in this way? So another good question, and I responded to this by saying the most harmful behavior that we would probably see in a student whose family is going through a divorce is self-loathing or self-blame. This happens all the time with kids whose parents are getting divorced. They tend to blame themselves, or they think that something's wrong with them and that they somehow caused this divorce to happen. So eventually these thoughts and feelings of self-loathing and self-blame eventually to poor self-esteem or a low self-worth. So if you think that something is your fault, or if you think that you messed up in some way, and if that thought is constantly going through your mind, you're going to eventually think that there's something wrong with you, or that you're not good enough, or that you're not whatever. That self-worth, self-esteem will definitely drop. And a lot of times this results in behaviors, or it manifests in ways such as more aggressive behaviors, or even a lot of times it's depression. Those are the two big ones that I've seen with kids whose parents are going through a divorce. They either act out aggressively, or they withdraw and they become depressed, or you may see depressive-like symptoms. And it's similar to answer number one. It has to do with that attachment and that fight, flight, or freeze response. So because kids become more depressed or aggressive or irritable during a divorce situation, they are in a constant state of hypervigilance, like we talked about. This fight, flight, or freeze response often results in either fight, which is usually seen in aggression, or kids getting in more fights at school, or just having a shorter temper. They just get a more aggressive personality. That's one way it can manifest. Or the other way is through the freeze response, which we see a lot of. This would be seen by those concepts that are associated a lot with depression, like hopelessness, worthlessness, feelings of being stuck, just not wanting to do things, or just not interested in things that used to interest them. Those are the two big ways that I see that kids tend to respond in these divorce situations. The next question he asks is, why do children in these households often have problems in relationships later in life? So the short answer to this is that it depends. That's a pretty common answer for most of these questions. But just to go into a little bit more detail, when a child builds a bond with a parent at a young age, that bond becomes the basis for pretty much all other relationships throughout their life. So because these bonds are so deeply ingrained in our brains and our psyches and our personalities, a separation, or a perceived separation or threat to that bond, can manifest in someone having trust issues or developing trust issues for other relationships. And since trust is kind of a crucial part of any relationship, it may not be the most important thing, but it's definitely one of the most important things. A child may have a more difficult time building and maintaining relationships throughout their life if this problem is not addressed. So I say if this problem is not addressed because certainly if you have access to counseling services or other mental health services, you're able to do some interventions, or if someone just has a really good support system, that can kind of mitigate some of these problems or some of these concerns, and it can lessen those detrimental effects. But that's if they do have access to those things, or if they're able to get them in early enough so that they can come up with coping skills, or they can come up with different ways of perceiving the situation so it's not as impactful, negatively impactful for them later in life. The next question he asks is, do you think trauma has a long-term impact on the child, or will they, and in quotes he says, grow out of it? So, answer to that one. For those who don't know about trauma, first of all, trauma is, I think a lot of times we think of like PTSD, veterans who come back from wars, they experience trauma. That is a type of trauma, but there are all different types of trauma. Trauma can come in many shapes, sizes, colors, degrees, levels. It's very complex. So just like trauma, every situation is different and has different effects on different people. So again, the short answer is it kind of depends. With support and maybe a little bit of counseling, most students can work through these issues that come with divorce, and they can find effective ways to cope. Kids are typically more resilient than I think we give them credit for. But if a divorce is really ugly, or if there's a lot of drama involved, it can be more of a traumatic experience for the child, especially if you have a situation where parents are kind of playing each other, or maybe trying to manipulate each other or guilt trip each other by using their kids. And unfortunately, that does happen quite often. So that's something that you definitely want to watch out for. So that can make the experience more traumatic, which can have more long-lasting effects. I've seen and spoken to many people who have, quote, grown out of it. And it's not that they've really grown out of it, it's just that they've found ways to deal with it, and they've found ways to cope with it, and they've addressed and processed through those thoughts and those feelings. Many adults have done that. But I've also met many people and talked to many people who haven't, or who did not get those interventions, or they didn't have access to counseling, or they didn't have a good support system, that those effects still impact them as adults. So the traumatic experience of their parents' divorce that they had when they were a kid is still affecting their relationships as adults. So you do see that, unfortunately, sometimes. His next two questions, I kind of answer them together because they are very similar, and these answers are more so my opinion. They're not really concrete, solid, factual answers, I guess. This is just what I've experienced in my job. So just keep that in mind. Some other people may disagree with the way I'm about to answer them, so just kind of keep that in mind as we go along here. So the next two questions are, the first one, at what age would you say kids are more vulnerable and could be hurt more emotionally with a divorce? And then the question that follows that, it says, do you think the age of the child at this time has any effect on their acceptance or their tolerance of a situation? So I do think these are kind of similar questions, so I answer them together. And I said, I don't think that there is a, quote, age, like a numerical age, at which kids are more vulnerable to emotional scarring or emotional harm or damage due to a divorce. It has more to do with their developmental levels. So any person who's been through courses on development or child development, you know that there's different levels that kids go through in their development. It doesn't have so much to do with their age. Some kids spend a lot of time in certain stages of development and they move through other ones very quickly, so it just kind of depends. So it has more to do with their developmental levels and their experience with the divorce itself. Kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, it's a case-by-case thing. Not all divorces are the same. Not all people respond to divorces in the same way. Oh, sorry, that's our bell ringing. Some parents do a good job of keeping a divorce from affecting the students or their children. They may try to deal with it behind closed doors. They don't let their kids get super involved or close to the situation. And that can be helpful, and it can lessen these long-lasting effects or these detrimental effects. Other parents, though, like I was saying before, they don't do such a good job at this. A lot of times they allow the kids to kind of get in the middle, and the kids get very involved, and it just doesn't really end up being a good situation, and it can make the experience more traumatic for the kids in the long run when it's in their face and they're constantly having to deal with it. In my experience, to answer the question about what age are they more tolerant or accepting, honestly, it sounds kind of backwards, but in my experience, it's the older students that have a harder time processing or accepting or tolerating the fact that their parents are getting a divorce. I don't really know the hard truth, like the why this happens. I could make some guesses, though, and one of those guesses would be that because older kids have a more prominent ability to think abstractly about concepts like love and attachment and family, that maybe because of that ability to think more abstractly, it makes everything kind of more complicated for them. So they may be thinking about all these other factors and variables, and the whole situation to them seems more complex, so they may have a harder time processing through it.
Katie Tran to the office, please. Katie Tran to the office.
Sorry again. So that might be one guess. The other reason could be that simply because kids are older and they've had more time to build attachments with their parents, and they have had more time to create this concrete idea of what a family is and what a family should be, that when they hear about the news of divorce or they go through it, it kind of throws their whole world into chaos because their whole belief system is kind of upended and it becomes very difficult to process. So basically what I'm saying there is, if you've had 18 years to get used to something, it's harder to deal with change than something you've only been experiencing for 5 years, is kind of the main point of what I'm saying there. And again, those are just my experiences. Some people may disagree, but that's just kind of what I've seen here in my practice and my job. So the last question he asks is, do you think it is best for the child to be able to see both parents, whether in visitation hours or if it's joint custody, or is it best if one parent is allowed custody to maintain continuity? And he adds here, assuming that there's no physical abuse or any kind of abuse involved, really. So obviously, if people are getting divorced because there was an abuse situation, you don't want the child to be spending time around someone who's abusing them, obviously. So we're excluding that. We're just talking about, we're assuming there is no abuse going on. My answer to that, since it is kind of a loaded question, it's a very complicated question, it's a complicated answer. So what I said is, in an ideal world, as long as a child has a positive relationship with both parents, then absolutely, they should be allowed to visit both parents. Even if they don't entirely get along with one parent or the other, still, they should be allowed to see both parents, and they should still be given a chance to have a relationship with both parents. It is true that consistency and continuity are important for kids. It helps with their stress levels, it reduces anxiety, it is good in a lot of ways. But you can still have that same consistency even though parents are in separate homes. Does it make it more difficult? Absolutely. But it doesn't mean that it's impossible. Now, because divorces are always complicated and they're always filled with emotions, it's very rare that you see one take place where the dynamics in a family or between family members, like parent to parent or parent to child, child to parent, it's very rare that those dynamics are not affected. Many times as a divorce progresses and as it's seen to fruition and it goes through the process and it's finalized, the relationship between a child and either one or both parents will somehow change. So anytime you change an entire family structure, which is what happens when a divorce occurs, every person's role in that family is going to change to some degree, okay? And when this happens, you may end up with parents who don't see it as important to see their kid as much. It happens. And on the flip side of that, you may end up with a child who does not want to see either one or both parents as much. However, that doesn't mean that you should just take that relationship away completely. So, yeah, that doesn't mean that, one parent should really be kept from seeing their child just for the sake of keeping things consistent. Most times divorces are not just one person's fault. Typically, both parents will try to blame the other, but usually it's something in the middle, right? You always have like two sides of the story and the truth is somewhere in between. It's typically not just one parent's fault. It's usually a combination of both parents having a hard time in the relationship, so they chose to end it. But that doesn't mean that just one person, or it doesn't make sense for one person to be punished or one person to be given a more severe consequence, like not seeing their kid, because this is typically something that's not just one person's fault. So the bottom line of that is, divorces are complicated and they're filled with emotion, and every decision that's made is always going to be complicated and it's going to be full of lots of variables, and each decision should be made on a case-by-case basis. And the one thing I would add to that is, for parents, when you are making those really tough decisions like visitation and custody and time between homes, when you're making those really tough decisions or coming up with those plans, I really would encourage you to not include your children in some of those big decisions. And the reason for that is because although we'd like to think, especially with our older kids, we like to think of them as young adults and that they're mature enough to handle some of those decisions, because these situations and these decisions are so tied into emotion, it's very difficult to make a decision without one person or the other becoming offended or having bad feelings about it. So for example, if you ask your child, say, hey, do you want to live with mom more often, or do you want to live with me more often? And if the child says, well, I'd kind of like to live more often with mom, as the father, you're going to have an emotional reaction to that answer. Even though in your mind, logically, it makes sense and you're the one that asked the question, it's still going to hurt. And you're still going to have that sting. And those hurt feelings and that stinging feeling could eventually create animosity between the student or the child and the parent. And another way is a lot of times kids who are thrown into the situation or thrown into the middle and they're expected to make all of these decisions or be involved in these decisions, they can develop their own feelings of frustration and animosity towards their parents for putting them through that. So I just encourage parents, and I've told parents this, that divorces are difficult, and those really difficult decisions that you have to make, they need to be made from the adults. You should really try to avoid having the kids involved in those decisions, even if they're 17, 18 years old. They're older kids, we think they're more mature, but it's still best to try to avoid including them in those big decisions. So that's that. That last one was kind of long-winded, but like I said, it was a loaded question. It was a very complicated question, so it deserves a good answer. And again, those are just some of my opinions. These are just the things that I've experienced at my school and in my job, and my job as a counselor in our practice. Some people may disagree, but I thought this was a really good opportunity to make this video and to talk about some of these things, because like I said before, these things may sound obvious, or it may sound like things that everybody knows, but very often are they articulated or that we get to talk about them. So I wanted to, again, thank this student for reaching out and creating these questions, which were really good talking points to make this video. And that's that. So I hope you guys were able to learn something from this. I hope you were able to take something positive out of it. And hopefully we'll be more consistent with our videos. This was kind of a long one. It was about 20 minutes. So yeah, I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you next time. Bye.